ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Robert Zachary.
I would like to take you back, if you don't mind, way back in the Jim Crow South, Anniston, Alabama, during the early 1950s. You know, as young as far back as I can remember, there was this blind man who came with a knapsack on his back selling the Pittsburgh Courier. And my parents would always buy 2 or 3 copies. And by the time he left our house, our living in dining room was filled with people coming to read those newspapers about the Black going-ons in America. And they would bring their children, but these papers had interesting things, and they would sit there and talk about the events of the newspaper. Like, you know, there was one with when Emmett Till was killed, and one with the kings and queens of Africa, and it was just amazing. I remember the one with Lumumba when he was killed by the CIA, and how these grown men sat there in my parents' house along with their children and wives and wept because of Lumumba's death. And that was a time I just continue to think about it, when they really taught us about history. And at the end of every session, after sitting almost all day, the two most historians of the whole panel, my Uncle Mac, who was an AME minister, and Mr. Harris, would start out with a story, and then this dialogue, and it was always the same. And they would get us boys together. And as we grew older, 6, 7, or 8, and my Uncle Mac would start out, you know, you're going to be going downtown by yourselves, and we don't want any more Emmett Tills. So when you see 2 white girls on the same sidewalk that you're walking on, make haste and cross the street. And they gave us reference about drinking out of the colored water fountain. And Mr. Harris would start up. Whenever you drink out of the colored water fountain, even though we have to right now, but always hold your head up. Always hold your head up. Never bow to a Jim Crow water fountain. This was, it was amazing what they taught us. And even in the Black neighborhood, these same men were so present. They were so right there, giving, and coming from school or just out playing, and us children around. And it would always be 2 or 4 people playing chess or checkers. And we never understood how, you know, sometimes we might be getting into something or almost getting into some mischief. We never understood how Mr. Harris or Mr. Hall could continue to play the game of chess or checkers, never look up from the board, and call each of our names and send us home in the direction we lived in. It was just amazing. And we stayed that way for a long time. And I remember we walked to school. I walked to the elementary school in my neighborhood, but the high school was on the other side of town in West Anniston. But remember, these were the times of Jim Crow, and I just couldn't take going to the back of the bus. So from the 8th grade to the 12th, most times I was trekking those 3 miles and going to school. When we would near the school, we would all be together and we would see somebody's father. Mr. Henry, I remember the most. This big man, and it seemed like he was standing in the middle of the street waiting for us children to come and meet him. He had 5. And you see, during these times, if your wife or your woman friend who you had children by was on welfare, you couldn't live with your family. You had to stay somewhere else. If they caught you, and they used to have like Peep and Tom social workers. If they caught you in your house, mind you, at night, your wife was cut off from welfare. So Mr. Henry was one of these people, but he stood there waiting on his children. And when we got near, he had a quarter for each one of his children to buy lunch, making sure that they had lunch and they ate. And sometimes he would have a nickel or a dime for other children like myself. And without moving, exact on the money, he would bless his children. And many times he would put his hands on my head. And I remember that because wherever I was with my father would introduce me. He'd place his hand on my head and say, "This is my son." And I would look up with starry eyes and say, "This is my daddy. My father made me proud." And I remember it especially at 15 when my Uncle Mac, the same Uncle Mac, stepped in and said he would take me to 17th Street Baptist Church to see Dr. King. And I was one of the few fortunate ones, young people, able to see Dr. King and go up and talk to him because of my uncle. And when I went up, Dr. King placed his hands on my head and said these words, "Keep on keeping on and never forget." It meant so much to me. And this was the cohesiveness. And these were the real men of the Black community. And we saw these men every day. We mingled with them. They were part of the community. They were really present. And even if there was some issues in the community, and I remember one, my daddy and Mr. Pope and Big Johnny would have to go down and quiet John D. down. Sometimes he was having it out with his wife, and they had children. And the word was, we have to find another way to solve this because we don't want the police in the Black community. We rather handle our own problems, our own issues. And my dad and these men were right on it all the time. And my dad was a big part of our community. And one reason I didn't know until many years later, my dad had been the mascot of the Victory Day Parade in 1945 before I was born. And the way he got to be that, he was a contractor and there was no work. You only worked in factories making weapons. And my dad picked up scrap metal and had on the side of his wagon getting scraps to beat the Japs. And he was asked to be the mascot of the Victory Day Parade. So everybody knew my dad, and I really couldn't do no wrong. So basically, in 1961, my dad was not a church man, but we lived right next door to our church. And it was a Sunday morning. And my dad walked in church, tapped me on the shoulder, and whispered to me that the Freedom Riders bus had just been firebombed in my hometown. And all the young people sit together in church. And we just went into shock. We started screaming, crying, and we just ran out of church. They had to stop church. And when we got outside, it was all these mostly Black men outside mingling together. And in a few minutes, my dad and two of my brother-in-laws and the same Uncle Mac who came down, they all got in cars and went to the scene of where the bus burning was. And we waited around all day, all Sunday afternoon and into the night. Finally, they came back home with a report that Dr. King and Dr. Shuttleworth had sent cars, a convoy of cars, to Anniston, to the hospital, and to the scene of where it happened to get the Freedom Riders, John Lewis and James Farmer and all the rest of them. And no harm came to them because these men were not afraid and they stood up. 4 years later, again, on a Sunday morning, my dad walked into church, taps me on the shoulder, and whispers, "They have attacked the activists, the marchers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama." It was Bloody Sunday. And they were headed to Montgomery, Alabama, the capital, 50 miles away. They were going to walk in protest, and they attacked them. And we knew many of these people. My brother-in-law, Reverend Willie Joe Robertson, my Uncle Mac and his wife was there, but they were not on the bridge. They stayed at the church. And we were just dumbfounded as to what to do. And it was like almost every other church in Anniston and in Hobson City, one of the few all-Black cities in America, there were mass meetings at these churches. And we went mass meeting hopping and we tried to make as many. I was able to make 3. And the word was, we need to show our support by boycotting school. And all week long, we talked about it. And on that Friday, the principal, S.J. Wissenhunt of my high school, got on the intercom and said, "Listen, I hear that many of you plan to not come to school Monday and to boycott. because of Bloody Sunday. And I want to let you know, if you don't come to school on Monday, Tuesday morning, you have to have your dad to bring you back. You can only have your dad. Your mom can't get you back into school. And we were so determined, it didn't matter to us. We were going to stay out of school on Monday. And Monday morning came, and I got up as if I were going to school, and we all met up at different churches near the high school. And there they had great speakers. Uh, I think I remember the Reverend Joe Boone was one of the speakers, and I believe Andrew Young, and um, it was just amazing. So basically, we stayed around those mass meetings all day, and they taught us about meditation, and we sang spirituals, and these civil rights workers taught us about nonviolent communication. And then Tuesday morning came, and my dad said to me, "Son, get up. I'm taking you to school." And I sort of looked in amazement, because I didn't tell my dad what was going on, and I was trying to figure how he knew this. But anyway, I got dressed, got silently in the car, and by the time we got to Cobb High School, we could hardly find a parking space, and it was never like this. And after we found a parking space and got out, I went on around, me and my dad, and I had never seen so many men in my life. It was 500 to 600 of us who stayed out on the previous day to boycott, but it was like 1,000 Black men there to get their children back in school. And it was so much pride, it was so much joy. We had a stride about us. And me and my dad went on in, and I found out something else too, that my dad and the principal knew each other on first name basis. Uh, Mr. S.J. Wissenhunt, when he saw my dad, said, "Hey, Robert," that was my dad's name, and my dad said, "Hey, S.J., how you doing?" Then the principal turned to me and says, "Zachary Jr., you go on to class," and he told my dad to come on in the office. Well, there's a little something I found out. I didn't know at the time, but my dad sold liquor uh, to the teachers and the principals and the Black mail carriers, and to the mayor and other white folk of Anniston. So that was it. But I walked on to class, and walking down that hall was a real phenomenon. Every teacher in the school was standing in their door. And as we walked to class, some shook our hands, some bowed to us, some, like Dr. Lewis said, "Good job." And it was so much, it meant so much to us. And I went to Mr. Garrett's class, and a lot of the teachers had rolled in a portable TV, and so not just that day, but for the rest of the week, we pretty much didn't have class in any of the classes. It was discussions, it was excitement, and most of all, it was pride. And it was pride about our fathers who stood forth for us. And I'd like to fast forward to 2017. I graduated in 1967. from that same high school. In 2017, we had our 50th class reunion. And I was asked to be the MC. And during the ceremony, I'll never forget, Wynn and Phillips stood up and they sort of challenged me and said, did you ever think why Mr. S.J. Wilson Hunt said we'll have to bring our dads back? And not only me, but over the whole body of people, it was like a home, like, yeah, we've thought about that. Well, they said, we know the answer. And they told the story of how Mr. Wilson Hunt called their fathers. So he probably called mine too. And how Mr. Wilson Hunt explained that he was working to appease an all-white Board of Education. And he knew that he could win them over by their stereotypical ideas and ways, to the fact that they didn't believe and didn't think that Black men would stand up for their children and their families. It was stereotypical that, we've heard this before, they went around and they're not in the home. So we'll have a chance to suspend or expel a whole bunch of these little Black kids. But what they didn't know is Mr. Wilson Hunt knew how to work the body and the camaraderie that existed in the Black neighborhood, and called on the fathers to be supportive. And it didn't take much effort, he said. And hence, those seemingly 1,000 Black men were there that day. And I would like to thank all those ancestral beings and the Black men of today who are the real men who have taken on the baton of keeping it going, keeping it real, and standing forth for what's ours, and being able to salute ourselves on this soon Father's Day in America.